One. Hey everybody, I'm Francesca Maxime and this is WiseGirl, and I'm here with a special conversation today with Deborah King. She is a New York Times bestselling author. Her first book, Truth Heals, What You Heal Can't Hurt You, was a bestseller, and she also just released the Simon & Schuster publication, Heal Yourself, Heal the World. Again, an amazing author and spiritual healer, somebody who's worked in this space for a long time on her own personal journey and her own work, in addition to having graduated from UC Davis in Northern California with a law degree and was a practicing attorney before all of this stuff as well. So Deborah, I just want to say thank you so much for joining me for this conversation today, where we're trying to further the conversation about MeToo and Time's Up to include family sexual abuse, otherwise known as incest. So thank you.
Yeah, no, I'm very interested in talking about this. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm glad to talk to you. And, you know, I think that one of the things people don't pay a lot of attention to is the fact that this happens in the home under our noses, and half of the, girls that are experiencing abuse, because mostly it is girls, although it does happen to boys as well, and we don't want to neglect that fact. But the majority of cases, it's girls. Nobody ever talks about it. And you have a personal experience about this. So I want to know if you could share your story briefly with us.
So I did not start to think about the abuse that I had experienced until I was in my 20s. I was just out of law school, actually, kind of planning on taking the corporate world by storm. And I woke up with cancer one day. And I was not yet 25, and I was like, there must be something really wrong with this picture. And besides getting immediate diagnostic help and direction from doctors, I thought, maybe I can go deeper here. Maybe there's some emotional cause. And I had never really wanted to think about my life. I was just, moving so fast that I thought it wouldn't be necessary. But I got out of that fast lane and I pulled back and I really looked at myself, and I realized that I was really, really screwed up. I was band-aiding all my emotions, none of which I could name. I was band-aiding them with copious amounts of alcohol and Valium, often in combination. So, it's amazing. Yeah, it's amazing I'm still standing. And so that's where I started, actually. I started at AA. With my recovery, and I was just there a few weeks, and I got so much clarity from withdrawing the poison from my brain that I thought, I wonder about meditating. Now this, Francesca, was so many years ago. People didn't meditate, and I just saw a little tiny ad in a newspaper. Remember, there were newspapers, and so I followed up on that. This was pre-internet, and I learned to meditate, and I injected that into my consciousness, and wow, the terrain really changed. Within months, I was truly, a very different person. And I thought, I knew I'd had an extensive incestuous relationship with my father, who I adored, who was still living, and I had memories of my mother knowing, but I knew she would never acknowledge it. And so I decided the way to come to grips with that was to write a book. And my first book, Truth Heals, was really the product of some, I can't recall now, but 20, 25 years of writing, a line at a time. It was a journal that became a book. And when it was published, it was before the days when anyone except Oprah was talking about sexual abuse. So it caused a lot of problems for me. My family basically shunned me. And go ahead.
Well, I was just going to interject, because I know that it's graphic, but it is on your website. And so just to give our listeners a real sort of a reality check about what we're talking about. You're talking about you were 2, 3 years old when you first were starting to be molested by your father. You were actually raped by your father when you were 9, I believe.
6. And it all ended when I was 12.
Okay.
Ended.
And then you went on to go work in his law practice,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of the things that you detail in your experience in your website and in your writing have to do with the fact that it's about power and control as much as it is, and secrecy, and the lying that you learn to incorporate into your life, which I would suspect you're saying manifested in your case in the cancer somatically.
Right. And I went into, again, before I had recovered from cancer, I went in to the field of energy work because I had a session with an energy practitioner posing as a massage therapist. I had this session with this gal, and all of a sudden I had a lot more memories than I'd had before. I mean, I remembered the abuse, but I had it compartmentalized. Mm-hmm. And I used to take it out and think about it about once a week. And in that case, I had a little bit of a split personality. I called that person not Deborah, but Cindy. Mm-hmm. It was just to protect myself. And so I would roll this memory out at night when I was in bed. I wrote about once a week. So, it was a very familiar memory. And when I finally just sat down and wrote about it and talked about it and met with my mother and talked to her about it, the incidences, the Cindy disappeared. She just disappeared because I uncompartmentalized my brain. It became all one memory and one experience, and so I didn't need that divide or that facade, which I thought was pretty interesting. I remember observing that and thinking, isn't that interesting?
Right. No, for sure. Having that, being able to integrate that narrative and the reality of your own life. Yeah. And you mentioned that it blew your family apart when your book was published. It became public. Can you talk a little bit about that and whether or not you hesitated to say anything publicly because you feared the repercussion, or if it had just gotten to the point where you had to share your story because you wanted to help other people?
Had to, and no longer cared. Now, I also, because I became very involved, one of the biggest aspects of my recovery was this amazing energy work. So first I became a student of it, then I became a teacher of it. I remember hanging around the teaching workshops and teachers saying to me, "Oh, you're going to teach this." And I'm like, "Are you kidding? I'm a busy lawyer." Little did I know. And then I finally just opened a private practice where I worked with people, and I was astonished at the number of sexually abused people who came in my office. I didn't have a sign over my door that I was aware of, but it was just like a parade of people, not all women, also men, and also perpetrators. And so I did that for, 25 years. And so I have quite a vast experience in this field. And I have sort of moved on from it. And I don't think about it until I've seen something on the news.
Well, for a lot of people, what's been in the news lately, especially, the allegations against people like Woody Allen and even the Larry Nassar, because even though he might have not been biologically related to these young gymnasts, they were children, and clearly he was in a sort of parental caregiving role.
Absolutely.
But, for the strict purposes so those can be triggering situations for a lot of people who are home listening to the news, watching the news, and then feeling as though it's just a bit overwhelming because the numbers are quite high of women, children who have been victims of childhood, family, sexual abuse, of incest. They're actually much higher than I think people even imagine, and probably higher than even is on record because not everybody records this. Nobody records
the vast majority of it goes unreported. So just take those numbers that you read, that 1 in every 3 women and 1 in every 5 men, and double or triple it. It's a pretty high number. And you mentioned early on when we first started talking that it's not so much about sex as it is about power. And that's totally the case.
So can you explain that dynamic a little bit in terms of how it plays out, in terms of what it is that a kid is feeling and thinking or not thinking when someone who is charged with their care begins using them in a way that is only about their own pleasure in this case.
Pleasure. Mm-hmm. It's just, most children repress it and don't remember it. That's what usually happens. And every therapist knows this, and I teach it, that you would never push someone or ask someone, if you suspect they've been abused, you would never bring it up. Because all you'll do, if they have that protective mechanism in place, that repression from childhood, you'll just push it deeper and possibly disturb them to a point where they're not functional. So that's a really important cautionary rule, is you never ever quiz someone. I mean, when I can tell when I just look at somebody if they've been abused, and I would never bring it up. They have to bring it up. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then we can work on it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that's what we're trying to do with having this conversation right now, is to normalize the conversation around the fact that family childhood sexual abuse or incest often is not talked about or named properly, even though if you do a simple Google search and you hit the news button, you'll see dozens within the last week or weeks from all around the country and all around the world of reports of documented people who've been arrested, where that is actually part of the charge that is included. It's not as though it's a secret, but it's something that nobody wants to discuss, because they would say, not me, not in my home, not my stuff.
And too distasteful.
Mm-hmm.
Most people, I think, feel a sense of repugnance. Like the Woody Allen thing, I find it very distasteful. I think that's a common reaction.
Mm-hmm. So then how do we change the conversation about not making it distasteful, mm-hmm. but making it something that is part and parcel to the conversation, so that, in my hope would be, and I would suspect yours as well, to begin to change the root causes of what is the genesis of this behavior in the perpetrator in the first place, so that it doesn't continue to happen. Because what I see is that so many women who are the victims of childhood family sexual abuse or incest end up in the kind of a situation that you did or me. You heal later, you figure out things later as an adult. By then, it's not like you're going to really, do much with the person who's the perpetrator. Oftentimes they're dead, deceased, long gone, moved on. You've established a different kind of life in many ways. Not all, but sometimes. And then you will have realized, as you did through a life of substance abuse, as I did through a life of drinking as well, that you end up perpetuating more problems in your life, because you've been trying to manage this amorphous, not really
secret. Yeah. And you're also managing a huge amount of shame, because what the dynamic is that the adult feels shamed by his or her actions. They know this isn't right. They feel compelled to do it. And once they've engaged in it once, then it's very addictive. So they'll engage in it again. So they have all this shame. What do they do with it? They deposit it in you, the child. You pick up on all the child always blames themselves anyway for everything that goes wrong in the family. They certainly blame themselves for this. And then they'll have another caregiver, like their mother, saying, well, it's your fault. You were too seductive at 3. So the child grows up with all this shame, with a pattern of having experienced this. Usually it's unconscious. They don't normally remember it. They just feel shameful. And then the next thing, they find themselves doing the same thing as an adult with their children, their nieces, the neighbor kids. It repeats itself.
It repeats itself, and this cycle of abuse, as it's kept a secret, as we've seen in institutions. For example, we've seen
the Catholic Church.
Correct. We've seen it, in various institutions, the whole blow up in Hollywood in terms of cover-ups for the kind of workplace sexual harassment or abuse. I think that is all a really important conversation, but because it's out there with famous people and with people who are in high profile positions, it's grabbing a certain amount of attention and headlines. But this is much more insidious. On the other hand, it's very much a part of what is currently in the ether with the most popular TV show that we have right now, Game of Thrones. Two of the folks that are on there are brother and sister, and they're in an openly incestuous relationship where they've fathered 3 kids. And in your research and in your teachings, you've talked about the fact that this goes back a long time. I'm not saying that it's correct. I'm saying that incest as such is not a new phenomenon.
No, not at all. And it was totally correct then. For those more those earlier societies, that's how they chose their next monarch. The monarch.
What can you just give us an example, like the
like the Hawaiians, for example. They felt that they had to have a leader that came from that bloodline, a leader that carried the godlike features. So, the early societies believed that their king or their queen was the representative of the divine that would lead them to safety, lead them to happiness, lead them to a life they'd be proud of. And so it was terribly important to them that they stay in that direct family line. And so brothers and sisters had to marry and had to reproduce to have the next king or queen. It wasn't done for, if you just look at the whole Hawaiian story as really a great example, it wasn't done for reasons of amassing wealth. It wasn't done for anything incorrect. It was really done to preserve the connection to the divine.
And given that, just as an example of it existing in history, it's not something that we have not lived with for many, many years, and yet it continues to be the thing that is, and for good reason, taboo. But
it became taboo because of the birth defects that result from that practice. That's where the taboo came from, and so the churches started to, and not that long ago, you understand. So in our cellular memory, each and every one of us humans has this memory. But for the last, 500 years, it's been taboo, maybe not that long. And so, we're, as a society, we're torn. It's like we believe that monogamy is the way to go, but that's a fairly current belief. Most monotheistic religions, very recently, some of them even today, believe that, you could have a number of wives, of course, so that you can have lots of children.
Right. I think there's a lot of changing ideas and mores, but I think that there's nobody here that would suggest that you would want to invite any kind of a relationship that you had, for example, with your father in that position of subjugation and having...
No, it's very patriarchal.
Right. So let's talk about that, because that's really the larger container that I think this is in when it comes to power and when it comes about the perpetuation of abuse by the abuser. You recently wrote a post in which you were talking about part of what needs to be addressed in terms of the perpetrator is awareness, acknowledgement, appropriate punishment, forgiveness, and redemption. Can you talk about how that fits in with patriarchy and toxic masculinity and the abuse of power?
Well, it's the only way we're going to resolve the problem. If we continue to simply treat our perpetrators the way we're treating Larry Nassar, for example, which I thought was, I think that the sentence was correct. I doubt Larry Nassar can be rehabilitated and set free to wander schoolyards. I don't think that's ever going to happen. But I wanted Larry Nassar to be sent to a place where he could use his medical training to help, people in poverty or, still in prison. But think of all the ways that he could be redeemed. When he's redeemed, this affects each and every one of us because we are all connected. So as long as we are simply punishing but not offering a path of redemption, we are not an enlightened society.
Well, why is it that people are not willing to see that as a possibility in any way, shape, or form, whether it's him or someone who has done, for example, a murderous activity or whatnot. You know, how does this?
Well, it's the same reason we still have the death penalty. It's another absurd choice of managing society, because it doesn't take us as a group up, it takes us down. It's a reduction in consciousness to think that if we engage in murder, that we are somehow resolving something.
So what's keeping us from looking at this in a way that holds the victim sacred and knows that they have no part in, you know, having contributed to the origin of having been abused, and needing to make sure that they are held and being able to get the kind of therapeutic help and recovery that they need, so that they don't take on shame and live a life that's contracted and otherwise, you know, not free, while also holding the space of saying, and for anyone who has been a perpetrator, we need to have there be an opportunity for rehabilitation and some kind of awareness of the root causes of what it was that was the origin of the abuse to begin with.
I think the solution is precisely what we're doing right now. We're talking about this in an open way with no reticence, no shame. And if we can get everybody to do that, we can resolve this problem, because this is an illness. These perpetrators are on the whole really ashamed, and they would love healing. It's an illness. It's an illness.
Let's shift the conversation back for a second to victims and the folks who are really kind of coming out saying, you know, I'm being abused, I've been abused, I'm finally speaking out, I have a lot of anger. For example, in the case of workplace sexual harassment, as a young actress, I know Rose McGowan has been making the rounds lately, doing talk shows with her new book, I think it's called Brave, discussing how she was the victim of Harvey Weinstein, and whomever else. I don't know if there was anyone else. And what is needed? Is outrage a part of a journey of healing?
I think so.
Or is it, or do people stop there? And, you know, what happens when?
Well, it's so interesting that you mentioned Rose McGowan, because I'm watching it and hoping that I'm going to see her hit the next level any moment, because I think she's been locked in a cycle of outrage for 20 years. This incident, as I recall, happened 20 years ago. And I would have preferred that she be able to work through it as I did, say within 5, at the most 10, but not take up 20 years of your valuable life in outrage, which is not a healthy place to be. It's a very negative state of mind. It's not uplifting her. She can do more good for people, I think, by moving on to the next stage. Her book, by the way, I'm reading it right now, and it's great. But the thing I found pretty interesting is that before she had the Harvey Weinstein alleged incident, she was raised in a cult, and so she already had a sign on her forehead that said, "Abuse me."
Well, can you speak to that? Because I think there is research and evidence to support that, and this was alluded to in a piece that I wrote recently for Medium on this issue of incest and how it relates to the MeToo thing, is that a lot of folks who, I know one media executive who had sort of scanned the room for the folks that he thought might be more apt to
be vulnerable.
To be vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
And then those were the people that he ended up, cajoling into acts or situations that were not helpful, that were harmful to these women. And so, like you say, the sign on the head, it's almost like an animal, like you can sniff it in the air, who I can mess with and who I can't. Can you talk about that and what women who have not yet come to full awareness of the depth of their abuse, what they may be unwittingly, I don't know, what is it?
Sending a signal out, because I did it. And of course I wasn't aware that I was sending the signal out. But first there was my father, then there was a priest to whom my father confessed. And then the priest said to himself, the parish priest, small town, he thought, oh, now I have a new victim. So then I moved from the priest to an oral surgeon who was actually arrested and convicted for molesting a whole series of patients when they were under the anesthetic. So yeah, you're literally giving off a vibe of, I'm vulnerable. I can be used for your your needs.
Mm-hmm. And so when we look at then the setup of that, the origin of it being in the home, under the roof of where oftentimes is a competent, well-educated, middle-class family. I mean, this is an issue that cuts across race and class and situations. How does a kid say to a parent, this is what's happening, and I can't, do this anymore. You can't abuse me. You can't use me. And, how do you wake up the quote unquote parent who's looking the other way or who isn't aware or says they're not?
Well, the kid's never going to confront the person doing the abuse. They don't have that much power. And they're even afraid to tell a school nurse or a teacher, let alone their mother or aunt or grandmother. It's a terrifying experience for a child. It's much easier just to repress a thing. So that's why the incidence of reporting is so low. Children are baffled. They are dumbfounded because it strikes them as wrong. That's the message the perpetrator is sending to them, is the shame. So they think, I don't think this is right. It can also be painful. It's done in secrecy. They're told not to tell. I mean, it's hardly a setting where the child's going to run out and tell somebody, even if they've received training, as children do these days. That will, of course, bring improvements, but they're slow to come.
But can you also talk about the mixed feelings that when a child is dependent on their caregiver for basic platonic parental love, care, and affection, that there's a certain trust that is put on this person who is the caregiver from the child to sort of want to believe and hope that this really isn't maybe happening, or it's not as bad as I think it is, or
not as bad as I think, yeah.
Or they treat me nicely in other certain situations, and so I need to go along with this in order to get that.
Well, my own situation, I've discovered, having now seen thousands of people in private situations, and I work with volunteers now in workshops, is that there's quite a trade-off going on for the child. I was daddy's girl. How often does that happen? And he protected. He protected me from my mother, who despised me because she knew. See, she knew. So there was always this dynamic. This is a really common dynamic in families. Even where there's no abuse, it's a very common dynamic for the parent, for the parent of the opposite sex to form an alliance with the child against the parent of the other sex, because he or she hates their job, sick of their marriage, whatever it might be, and they get they form an emotional alliance with the child, usually around the age of 4 or 5. This is really common.
Mm-hmm.
No abuse present, just a dynamic in the family. And so, as a child, you gain quite a bit because you've got this parent that likes you the most.
But in your case, you were abused by the parent who allowed you.
And he adored me, and I adored him. So it was very confusing for me. Very confusing.
Because you went on, even as an adult, to work for him in the law firm.
Yeah, we were partners. And again, he never even looked at me after I was 12. He was truly a pedophile. Only children. I got too old.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Which isn't always the case. You also write about Mackenzie Phillips in your work and talk about the fact that she had an adult relationship with her. And
that, Francesca, don't you relate to that one with the most distaste? I mean, aren't we just horrified when we think about an adult parent with an adult child? In her case, it was so grim, I could even I could barely stand to hear about it or read about it.
What about this Dylan Farrow, Woody Allen story that is making headlines right now? Some people have said, saying that they're conflating his marriage to, the Mia Farrow's adopted daughter.
His daughter.
And his daughter. That they're conflating that with the Dylan Farrow accusations. But I think that there's a growing concern now that this is not anything that was fabricated, and that it seems as though he's starting to lose money deals, shows.
Good.
Around this. How do you think this could possibly galvanize people toward looking not just at the Hollywood, famous person takedown, but put the spotlight on the fact that there was abuse happening in a home?
I think it's easy for people to separate themselves from the Woody Allen experience and the Mackenzie Phillips experience. They'll just say, well, that kind of thing is grotesque. It doesn't happen in our family. We're Presbyterian. I'm throwing that out there. Not picking on the Presbyterians, but they'll have, we're upstanding members of the community. We belong to the Chamber of Commerce, something to distinguish themselves. People don't want to look at this dynamic in the family, but it is terribly common.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And Woody Allen is highly visible. That's why we're looking at him.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So when we're looking at the next part of the conversation, you say you and I are talking right now, we're having the conversation openly and we're trying to shed light on it. I've shared some of my story with you, which has to do with the fact that I had a narcissistic father, and he was certainly sexually inappropriate and emotionally abusive in many ways. And, my recollections of that inappropriate relationship came around midlife. I was in my early 30s, and that was more after I had had other big traumas and ruptures. And so one sort of cracked open this other piece. So for a long time, there was in me that conflict, like you had described, of, sort of shame and addiction and that whole cycle of feeling as though it is your fault, perhaps, or that there's something wrong with you. Mm-hmm. And I think that there's a lot of women out there who are women, they're not children, who have suffered abuse at the hands of their brothers and grandfathers and stepfathers and uncles and parents and father, who don't really have words to describe what's going on with them. They don't know how to pinpoint it because they maybe haven't had the breakthrough yet. What would you say might be some questions to women who are feeling like this all is cutting a little too close to home? They might think something is up. Where would they go with that? What would they do?
Well, I think what they've done is they've all said me too. They aren't saying me too to that, but they're saying me too to just like, look, that kind of thing has happened to me. They may very well be thinking privately about the incident with their brother or their uncle, and not talking about it yet, but they at least feel safe to jump on the bandwagon here and say, that creep when I was, in college. You see, they're starting. This is the beginning of a gigantic wave of resistance to the patriarchy. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Really, that's really what's going on here, and I'm so in favor of that. And writing about the patriarchy and its negative effects on all of us, men and women, because men are just as punished by this as women are. They don't want to be part of a patriarchy either. Not a thinking man, not a modern thinking contemporary guy. Mm-hmm. So we all want to get away. The pendulum swung 5,000 years ago, way over there. And who cares what caused it? Whether it could have been writing, by the way. But it just doesn't matter. Now we're coming into a new age, and it's time for all of us to start talking about this openly. The inequity.
So what is your average thinking man who's relatively intelligent, who thinks he's somewhat enlightened and somewhat fair, and even feminist to whatever degree, believes in equality, let's say, okay, what would you say that he would need to know about incest, and what would be important for them to be talking to other men about incest? Because even in your website, you talk about the fact that Freud himself was abused by a nanny. Sigmund Freud, the famed psychoanalyst, was abused by a caregiver. And then when he had clients come to him, female clients, that claimed that they were, in fact, being sexually molested by their family members, their fathers, their uncles, their stepfathers, whatever they were, did he believe them? But then he recanted and sort of switched gears on that. So I think men oftentimes, they equate. They want research, they want facts, they want proof. How do they start? Where do we start the conversation on this?
Well, just to back up and chat about Freud for a minute, I was always fascinated by that story because no one talked about it in college or in psychology. It was completely ignored, the fact that Freud had a string of women come to him for help, and as I recall, it was labeled hysteria. The disorder they had, and they all had the same disorder. And when he interviewed, and did an intake on each one of these women, they had the same story of when he finally dug deep enough, they would confide in him they'd been abused. And so he came out with, he thought was this amazing piece of new information for society, that women are being sexually abused. And he was immediately shunned by everyone that counted, everyone that paid him, wherever his source of revenue was, got shut off. And he recanted. He backed up. He said, "Oh, I must have been mistaken." This is really the most amazing thing of Freud's whole career, and it's never talked about. So the patriarchy has its toehold in very deep in us, very deep. And I don't think men talk about this at all. I was really astonished. The blog that you referenced, that you read, where I talk about bringing some balance, I'm hoping to the next phase of the MeToo movement. I posted it on Psychology Today, and I was really surprised to see how many comments I got from men on that platform, thoughtful, educated men, successful men, who told me something I didn't realize, because that's not where I'm hanging out these days. I didn't realize how horrified they were about their risks in the workplace. One guy wrote in and said, "We're no longer hanging around the water cooler and talking about the hot girl in the office. We're hanging around talking about how we would rather pay the fine for lack of diversity than get entangled in a much more expensive lawsuit over sexual harassment."
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
You understand his point, that it'd be easier just not to have any women in the workplace.
Well, and it's easy for me to lose weight when I don't have any cookies in the house, but that doesn't mean that it's illegal to have cookies in the house. I should be able to have a certain amount of control over what I put in my mouth. Oh
yeah, I'm not agreeing with his point of view. I'm thinking about it, because it hadn't occurred to me that could be what men in the corporate world were thinking right now. I think they're puzzled. Mm-hmm. You might know way more about this than I do.
Well, from where I sit, in my experience, what I've seen is that men say, you'll hear this with people who are, people of color might say, for example, people with white skin privilege have no concept, no idea what it's like to be the one who is asked for a receipt when they're leaving a store, because they are asked to be checked about whether or not what they have is something that they actually bought. And if that's never something that happened to you as a white person, you wouldn't understand the sort of, the ether that we're in terms of racism, right? Even
right.
As I recall, got...
because we're swimming in the ocean of it, we can't see it.
And the same with patriarchy, right?
Yeah, totally.
And patriarchy in that way are very analogous. And so to that end, I've heard from men say, we just didn't know it was this bad. And of course, in much the same way that people of color, sort of are frustrated, hand-wringing, like, well, we've been telling you that it's been an issue for so long.
A couple hundred years, right.
Right. And so that the same I've heard from men about this, like, well, I didn't know. Well, I don't believe it. And I've also heard this from men who have been inappropriate sexually. And so the level of deceit within the person who is actually saying, I can't believe it or I don't know, is just showing a level of lack of awareness in terms of what even is, what equality looks like and even means. Because I mean, you know, with two adults, there's a certain degree of agency, right? With children, there's no agency. There's always subjugation. So, you know, and the more I think in touch you get spiritually with meditation practices and that kind of thing, you bring online more agency, more prefrontal cortex, more of your own awareness, right? So you're not just going off of, like we were talking about earlier, women who have a sign on their head or something, right? You're more aware of whatever that might be, that programming that's in there, like you said, somatically. So I don't know how aware men are necessarily of the fact that, yes, all women have had to deal with feeling pressure around the issue of unwanted advances of some kind.
Right. Every woman on the planet. The one of the points of my blog was, I want to see levels, though. This was Bill Maher's point a few weeks ago. We need to see levels. Now, all of a sudden, it's like, yeah, I want to support the Me Too movement, and I'm part of it. Of course, I just was a little early. I was in the vanguard of it, but I still want to see. I want to see due process, and levels of not every crime is the same. Not every act is the same. An act of inappropriate exhibition of your own body is not the same as raping someone. And yet we seem to be lumping everybody in the same container and throwing them out into the ocean, saying your career's over, your work will no longer be valued. You can't come to the academies.
I hear what you're saying. What I would say, though, is that I do know that a lot of women who would say that I was traumatized by that exposure, I was an ingenue, or I was innocent, and I was, you know, in the case of, for example, young actresses and things, I was not, this was not something I asked for. It scarred me, you know, in that way. And so in that way, I think that recognizing that there is a level of trauma present with that, that the person
totally
is part and parcel to then recognizing that there are degrees of trauma. For example, if a person is, you know, raped by multiple people, or, you know, at knife point, and yeah, I hear what you're saying. If I'm understanding,
and I'm not discounting the pain that an individual may have suffered. I'm simply saying our hopefully a society is enlightened to the point where we acknowledge the fact that we have a justice system where we have degrees of guilt.
Don't you think at this moment, though, that there is already this backlash coming out from men who say, kind of like with the water cooler conversation that you were saying about these men saying on the blog that you published, where it's like, we're not ready for this. We don't want to have to change. We just want to have it not be around. How then are men going to be educated to start acting differently? Because isn't there a certain need to educate people as to what is appropriate and inappropriate behavior, that isn't just some pat, you know, sexual harassment video that they watch and sign off on when they, you know, start a new job or something, or have their annual review or whatever, that they know what the guidelines are. Where is the healing preemptively? Not in terms of restorative justice, but where is the preemptive?
Yeah, how do we stop the thing?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, here we are talking about it.
And even people who aren't perpetrators, right? Like even people who aren't perpetrators who were once victims of abuse, but for people who are regular, semi-enlightened guys who need to have a different viewpoint, frankly, or perspective on what's going on, and how they can not just be bystanders saying, well, it wasn't me.
Well, and I think, again, this is the conversation. It needs to happen everywhere, not just between the two of us, but And I think it is happening a lot. I think people are having it also with themselves. I think every woman that's around, in the modern world right now, is thinking to herself, well, what happened to me? What about that incident when I was a junior in high school? What was that really? I think everyone is having these thoughts, and men included. I think they're thinking, oh God, I wonder if that was sexual harassment.
Mm-hmm. But then there's this whole other thing of resentment and backlash that's coming out, because some women are saying, we need to just keep on keeping on, saying that this was wrong and there's no room for nuance about this conversation. And then there are other folks that say, as you do, that we need to be able to see it as a spectrum, and we have to be able to address it on multiple levels.
And we have to have room for improvement, change of behavior, redemption. We have to. It has to be the whole thing. We can't just be throwing everybody in a cauldron and that's the end of their life. That's not an enlightened society.
So moving toward an enlightened society, also a lot of times people have to get out of their trauma. They have to not just be stuck in that trauma time and shame spiral, and find ways to.
That's Rose McGowan. I would have hoped that 10 years ago, with therapy, with the kind of work I do, that she could have moved on and have more of a perspective. She feels, and my heart goes out to her, but she feels very trapped by her trauma. And that it shouldn't be. I mean, terrible things happen to us. We need to deal with them and then move on. I'm not saying that she shouldn't be in the vanguard of the movement and writing books about it, but she feels trapped to me, very trapped. Mm-hmm. That is not a healthy state of mind. That can hurt you. It can really hurt you. Your happiness level, your health. I don't advise it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, there's two kinds of help that people often need to get if they are willing to speak out. And one is if they have immediate sort of medical attention that they need, and then if they have emotional, therapeutic, work that they do by contacting an organization like RAIN,
right.
For example, or finding a therapist, a personal therapist, or group therapy for that matter. But then there's also the more spiritual work that you're talking about, which has to do with a more reconciliation internally about, where am I going to take my life forward. But I do just want to backtrack, because I think this is the crux of the issue, is that people who I know who have families who are, they have a young woman who came forward to say that she was incested by her father, for example, that the family gets blown up. It isn't the same. There's long-seated resentments. People don't talk about it, and there's hell to pay afterwards. And I guess I just wanted to circle back to that before we kind of wind down, because I want to know what you would say, given your experience in this arena, what you would say to anyone who's in the midst of that right now.
Well, that this too will pass, but not quickly. People form alliances in families. It's us against you and them against me kind of a feeling. And I think what I would really say is that you will rise above this. The person who has brought this information to the family, you're healing your family tree. It's much less likely to occur in the next generation for your children, your nieces, your nephews, your grandchildren, because you have come forward and talked about it. It's much less likely to occur. It does heal the family tree.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so don't expect it to have I would say a quick resolution necessarily. And it may be, are you saying that certain relationships you do lose, or that are in fact not repaired or not capable of repair, but it's worth the price, if you will, of sharing the story and airing it out?
That was my own personal experiences, that I've had some relationships that never really survived, but I felt it was way worth it. It was the key things I did for myself in my life were getting a handle on addictive behavior, learning to meditate, and confronting the abuse. that's what empowered me. That's what made me who I am today. Without those three things, I'd be a very troubled person. So, that's what I urge people to do.
Yeah, really take on their own healing. And to that end, we know that there's the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, RAINN.org, RAINN.org, and the National Center for Victims of Crime, the NCVC, also has a lot of resources, and Voices in Action also has a lot of resources there. And you're available too. I guess the next level is, like you say, the conversation about patriarchy, systemic patriarchy, and what to do about the lack of equality. Because I know Gloria Steinem told me herself when I was interviewing her a couple of years ago, she's like, we're linked, we're not ranked.
Wow, that's a beautiful saying.
We're linked, we're not ranked.
Right.
And so there's so much about that, right? Because in the ranking is the separation, that space in between, which creates further division. Because it's this perceived separation, when in fact, as mammals, we exist in interrelatedness and in community. We need people, as you know, right? We need our caregivers to take care of us, and we need other people.
We need our tribe.
We need our tribe, and our collective tribe can grow, right? We don't just need to limit our tribe to our neighborhood or our family, and I think that's part of it. It's the loyalty thing. People are loyal to their family, and a lot of times people are loyal to their suffering and to their secrets at their own expense.
Oh, totally. I see that more often than the reverse. Is that that's that negative pleasure where you really know the thing's hurting you, but you want to hold on to it. That's a little bit the Rose McGowan thing.
Because it serves how, in what way?
People get locked in a cycle of negative pleasure. Somehow it feeds. It can be a resentment or a jealousy. They really get locked in a behavior. And it's a downward cycle. It's not an upward cycle. So you're not becoming a happier, better person because of it.
So it's more a habit then. So what's on the other side? What would be better? What's more? What's the thing that hasn't been experienced, perhaps, by someone locked in that kind of a place, but yet that it's on the other side of the rainbow. It is the pot of gold, and if you got there and you had it, you would know that how much richer it could be.
Well, and that's why you and I both teach meditation. There's the pot of gold. Really.
Well, the key there for me is the being able to sit with yourself without having there be some nasty story attached to it about I'm not worthy, I'm a terrible person, or some version of that. And to just be in the space that is allowing and fluid. And it's not even a container, but it makes, there is enough space to hold the shadow side and the light, and for that kind of migration toward self-investigation, interrogation, and rehabilitation for everyone, not just for the perpetrator or for the victim or whomever,
Yeah, no, I've thought for a lifetime here that if I could teach the world to meditate, we'd be far better off. We're the only culture that has failed to give our children this gift that we don't know how to. So we don't, but all previous higher valued cultures did in one form or another, whatever they might have called it.
Well, I think we do have a focus on prayer here, but I'm not sure that is exactly what we're talking about in terms of getting to some of the, deeper issues that might be the interrogation stage that oftentimes meditation can bring. I think we're going to wrap it up there, Deborah. If you have anything else that you wanted to add or say or share about your website and your latest projects and how people can find you.
Well, I would say that if people are troubled by the topic we're on today of sexual issues that my my first book, Truth Heals, is pretty much on point. It would definitely answer a lot of questions for someone who's trying to figure out, what they should tell themselves or what they should do next about that. I really did cover it pretty thoroughly.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, Truth Heals, and your new book, Heal Yourself, Heal the World, is out by Simon & Schuster. That's new. And, Deborah, I know this is a very, it's a topic with a lot of tendrils, and it's very sensitive in a lot of ways. It's not easy to discuss necessarily. There's no right way or wrong way, I don't think, to have the conversation. But I think having a conversation about it, which we did today, is at least a step in the direction of trying to open up some space and trying to say, this is one thing that maybe in the shadow that we can bring some light to.
Yeah, no, it's been great talking to you about it.
Deborah, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Have a great weekend. Take good care.
You too.
All right. Thanks. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.